What's up, guys? Who in here was at Reg's talk? Awesome. And you guys all thought it was absolute bullshit, right? Good. All right, so I'm Tyler Wrightson. Let's get this party started. Damn it! Oh, I love that. He says, I heard it before. Let's see if we get to replay.
Who are you, and why should I care?
All right, so I'm Tyler Wrightson. I'm the founder of Elite Cybersecurity. We're based out of Albany, New York. All we do is penetration testing, offensive security. That's it, nothing else. We don't remediate issues. I've written 2 books, one on wireless network security, one on offensive security, in which I propose that a specific individual can acquire the skills necessary in a very short period of time to be able to hack into any organization. And I stand by that, and I think soon I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and train somebody from scratch. But anyway, why you want to listen to me is because I eat, sleep, and breathe security. It really is what I love, and even if I retired tomorrow, I would still do this. We have an awesome team at Elite. This is actually a picture of our team. And we have a growing team as well, so if any of you guys are looking for full-time work or even contracted work, reach out to me because we are looking for new people. Anyone seen any of my talks before? No one? You're all new? Awesome. So I despise interaction. If anyone speaks out at all, I will stab you. All right? No, I'm joking. I actually like the exact opposite. You're here, you know what I mean? You can watch videos online, and so you should take advantage of the fact that you are here. And if you have any questions, comments, you'd like to rebut anything, feel free to just shout out. Don't raise your hand, just shout it out. That's what I prefer. And I have an awesome announcement to make. So Anycon, which is a sponsor of BSides, we founded it this year. This is the first year of the conference. It's in Albany, New York, June 16th through the 18th. Dave Kennedy is keynote speaking. Iron Geek's going to be there. We've got a huge hardware hacking village, an awesome capture the flag competition in which we're testing every area of skills. So come join us. It's going to be a great time. And I'm actually giving away 2 free tickets during this talk, as well as the CTF winners here are getting free tickets to the con. So pay attention because I'm going to give away a couple things. And also we've got cool people sponsored. We've got like free stuff from No Starch Press. Southord is donating lockpicks and things like that. So it's really just a conference to have fun and grow the community in the Northeast. We still need speakers, so if any of you guys want to speak, you get a free ticket to the con. And really want you guys there. We hold a security meetup in Albany called Side Beer Security. It's free and formal, but if you guys ever find yourselves in Albany, let me know. You can join us. So finally, why are we here? Why are you in this specific talk? So ultimately, I want to share some cool war stories with you guys. I've always loved war story related talks to just hear how other pen testers have experienced different challenges and cool findings that they have. Just share some cool stories and hopefully give you some new techniques. I recently released some tools that I spoke about previously, things like LDAP or DAN, which is a command line based LDAP reconnaissance tool, once you have credentials or if it allows anonymous connections, to enumerate a lot of really good things that you can use in a pen test from an Active Directory LDAP domain. Other things like authenticating to OWA for phishing campaigns and some other stuff. After this talk, once I'm done with one of the engagements, because one of the engagements I'm going to talk about I'm actually still in the middle of. So on Monday morning, we're going to continue on with it. So you'll see where we're at right now. But I hope to release a couple of the tools that we created, as well as hopefully a white paper even. So you can check out my GitHub page there. So before we dive into the war stories, I always like to also talk about some of the interesting things that I've learned in the recent past. So I'm still reading this book, and I highly recommend this book. It is so awesome. We're big into the whole samurai martial arts kind of thing, and some of the specific things in here really stood out to me. One of them is a story that I wish I had heard before I wrote the last book because I would have included it. And it is, so the book is The Sword in the Mind. It's all about swordsmanship and mastering the sword. And so one of the best stories in this book is about a master swordsman who's walking along through a village, and there is a boy being held hostage in a barn. And so the master swordsman stops and he looks into the barn, and you guys got a sword to the little kid's neck. And so this master swordsman borrows a costume or the outfit from a Buddhist monk, and he approaches the door and he says, it's been a few hours. You're in there with the kid. You both must be very hungry. And the guy is saying, don't take another step in here. If you do, I'm going to cut this kid's throat. And the guy says, fair enough. I just want you guys to be able to eat. I know you've been in there for a long time. And so he rolls up 2 rice balls. And again, he approaches the door and says, I have these 2 rice balls for you. And the guy says, if you come inside, I'm going to cut this kid's throat. And so the guy says, yes, I will not come in. And he throws him the rice ball. And the guy lets go of the kid he's holding and catches it. And then the guy throws the other rice ball and he drops his sword and catches it. And so he runs in, tackles the guy, and supposedly this is a real story. And from that point on, he was considered one of the top Buddhist swords masters. Sorry?
Life-giving sword, was it?
No, actually, I don't know if it is. This does reference Life-Giving Sword in some of it. I have not read that book yet, but I cannot wait to read that book. So yeah, I thought that was a really awesome story. And if you really stop and think about it, like what they're really talking about is once you reach that upper echelon of understanding and mastery of your weapon, you can completely discard it. And that's one of the number one things that they talk about in this book is that to become the ultimate swordsman, you need to learn to defend yourself against someone with a sword with no sword. It's really a cool concept. Let me turn that down. So again, I really like that. It's an awesome story. Again, another story in the book was about a master swordsman who was basically challenging people while he was on horseback. And he said no one can defeat him while he's on horseback. He's the best mounted swordsman. And so sure enough, there's all these guys that are challenging him, and this one master swordsman that kept challenging him to face this guy and said, no, it's not worth it. And so finally they convinced him, and he rides up to the guy on horseback, gives the nose of the horse, of his opponent's horse, a little tap. The horse starts reeling, and the guy has no control over the horse, and so sure enough, he just knocks him off his horse. I thought it was a really cool, again, way of looking at outside of the box thinking, right? I thought that was really cool. And then there's 2 really important concepts within this book that I thought were awesome. And one of them is about obtaining knowledge and mastery of anything. And so I'll run through this really quick, and then I want to read a quick passage from the book. But it says, to reach a house, you must first enter the gate. The gate is a pathway leading to the house. After passing through the gate, you enter the house and meet its master. Learning is the gate to reaching the way. Because learning is the gate, don't think that the books you read are the way. Books are a gate for reaching the way. And so this is like a good example of how pithy but meaningful a lot of these Asian texts could be. I just love that the act of learning is just part of the process. And to get to that point where you have real wisdom, you can essentially, you need to differentiate those 2 things. And so one of the other really awesome things in here is this concept of exhausting all knowledge. And so I want to read this really quick. So it says, the great learning says, exhaust all knowledge and master everything. Exhausting all knowledge means knowing everything that is generally known in society and the principle of everything that exists, leaving nothing unknown. So I feel like I've gotten to that point myself. I know everything in society. No, I'm joking. All right. So this is a really, really interesting point. It says, while you don't know about something, you have doubts about it. Because you are doubtful, that something does not leave your mind. If the principle of that something becomes clear, nothing will remain in your mind. This is what is meant by exhausting all knowledge and mastering everything. And so to skip 3 paragraphs and get to the bottom, it says, that is the ultimate end of all disciplines. The final state of any discipline is where you forget what you have learned, discard your mind, and accomplish whatever you set out to do without being aware of it yourself. You begin by learning and reach the point where learning does not exist. That's freaking awesome. And so in previous presentations, I quoted a grandmaster chess player, and I wish I could find him because I cannot find this quote. I remember it from reading about chess when I was really young. And he says that to get to his level, it was always like learning individual tactics and techniques and steps was like climbing rungs on a ladder. And that once he reaches a new level, a new plateau, he was able to kick away the ladder because all of those specific things that he learned were meaningless and they didn't necessarily apply to him anymore. And so I felt like this was another really elegant way to talk about how in the beginning when you're learning things, and again this applies really well, in my opinion, towards hacking, that it's a very concerted thing, and you're learning about very specific things, but then you get to a specific point, and it all just becomes clear, and you stop worrying about that kind of stuff. So anyway, I thought that was awesome. And final point from this book is something that I'm still, I think it greatly relates to that last point about exhausting all knowledge, where they talk about this mind that never tarries, or this mind that doesn't rest on anything in particular. And so the examples they use to me are a little bit confusing. They talk about like touching a gourd on top of water or something like that. But it goes perfectly in line with that once you have a mastery over something, your mind does not stick with that thing, and it's free to roam, and that it's that roaming process that allows you to continue to be a master. It's a very pithy but awesome component. So anyway, read that book. It's freaking awesome, and then ping me on Twitter or something and let me know how you like it. All right, so let's get to the meat of this. These are my war stories, me and my team. My team has grown pretty large since the last conversation, or the last talk I presented. So this is me and my team. If you hear anyone else telling very similar stories, let me know so I can hunt them down and kill them. So we're going to go over 4 specific tests that we were on. One was physical infiltration at a healthcare organization. 2 was an external hybrid, because we were using offensive skills, but it was in a very staccato way. It was like, okay, test this. Okay, what did you find? Ask the client for approval. Okay, go ahead, keep going. And it was part of a very, very large, all-encompassing test. And I cannot talk about even the type of place, because it'll give away who they are and what they do. But let's just say they have giant stockpiles of money. We're going to talk about an external pen test that was completely open scope against a software company, and a really interesting one was this is the one that we're currently doing right now, which is breaking a thick client application. All right, so let's rock and roll. So the first one, physical pen test at a healthcare organization. Some of the talks I've given previously, we've broken into extremely secure environments, basically power plant monitors, where we came up with a whole pretext and disguised ourselves as FedEx and broke in and brought a huge pallet that was to simulate a bomb. This is not that situation. This is the exact opposite of that spectrum. And so when we do tests, we always want to gear it towards the specific client and the value that they can get out of it. And so the way we do that is that we simulate the threats that organization is likely to face. So sure, maybe someday this specific healthcare organization will have somebody go through the entire hassle of setting up a pretext that, FedEx delivering a thing and yada yada, but they're very, very unlikely to face that. What they are likely to face is somebody off the street doing something stupid. Maybe they have some technical skills, but probably not. It's probably just somebody roaming around looking for pharmaceuticals or easy money, or walk away with a laptop, something like that. So we wanted to simulate that. And so we decided to break it up into 2 groups of 2 people, to simulate 2 subtly different pretexts. One is people dressed kind of nice, like consultants, tie, sports jacket, whatever. And the other one was to simulate truly 2 idiots walking off the street, jeans, t-shirt, baseball cap, and see how far they could get. And so we basically kind of drew straws. Me and one of my guys drew the better one. We got the easier one, right? So we dressed as consultants, which again, if anyone in here has ever done any consulting, most physical security practices go out the window when they see somebody walking around in a tie, and you don't need to check in, go on through. So anyway, we went in. We entered through a side entrance. We did very, very minimal recon online. Normally it's a big, convoluted process, but again, we wanted to demonstrate what somebody with very limited knowledge would do. So all we did was identify the major entrances. We entered through the side entrance, went up. Everything was so beautifully labeled in this, staircases and all this stuff, east-west staircase and yada yada. So we entered the staircase, went to the second floor where there was sensitive departments of the business. Go to open it, and it's locked. Start walking. I think we were even headed down at that point. And the door swings open, and this guy goes, you guys looking for something? We go, nope, we're good. And we walked past him. And that was it. There's literally no other contact from that guy. So we were in the sensitive area because he just opened the door because he heard somebody jiggling the handle. So that was like a really good start of what was about to happen. So we're walking around through departments. A couple people asked us if we needed help. We basically said no and continued on. We made it to the elevators, which were all had hid RFID cards to go anywhere. So we hit some buttons, nothing happens. But in true adversary form, we tried every single button in there. And so sure enough, there was one labeled 7R, which is the rear of the elevator. And it turns out, at the end of the day, they kind of knew about it, that for some reason could not have key cards to access that location. And so we get up to the 7th floor, the rear of the elevator opens up, and we get out, and it's like this very small area. And so we're trying to see if it leads anywhere. And I mean like super small. It's like, this wide and maybe that long, and that's it. And the front of the elevator opens. And the guy goes, "You guys lost?" And we go, "Yeah, I definitely think we're lost." And he's like, "Where are you trying to get to?" And we say, 7th floor. He's like, "Oh yeah, you got to go around this. There's like a little door over here." He's like, "Or you can come through this way." I'm like, "All right, great, thanks." So we made it to the 7th floor, which was like a very restricted area, walking around. So that was basically our experience. We accessed some other sensitive areas, but that was it. And so for us, the real test was, what will these people that look like any Joe Schmo off the street, what will their experience be? And we gave them one. So I call them legitimacy triggers. We gave them one prop that they could use. I'll let you guys guess in a second what it was. But basically, they had more success than we did. And they were dressed, I wish I had pictures of them, because it was literally like t-shirt and jeans. One guy had a Yankees hat on, and one guy had like a beanie on. And they're just walking around, and they gained access to way more than we did. We literally had timed it so that we could all sit down with the client and kind of review the physical security findings that we identified right then and there. And they were gone for the entire meeting because they were having too much fun, like trying to hit every single room in this building. So anyone want to guess what the prop was? Yes, that's exactly what it was. So see me afterwards. I'll give you one of the free tickets to Anycon, as long as you can make it. Otherwise, do you think you can make it June? June 16th, 8th through the 18th? Albany? All right, cool. Free ticket. So yeah, it's funny, but that's literally all it takes in a lot of cases is something as stupid and trivial as that. Sometimes it's a printed shirt with something that says something like security. Sometimes it's a clipboard. Sometimes it's a thing that looks like their badges that has nothing on it. But that's all it takes. And so they got the same exact questions. Are you guys lost or what are you here for? They answered with one thing, and then they were good. And they could move on freely. So the unique thing about that, again, is that we weren't trying to be sophisticated. We wanted to know how their people, their processes, their security guards, their controls would hold up against an unsophisticated threat, because that's what they were likely to face. So yeah, that was a good one. Any other questions about that one?
Is the term legitimacy trigger, is that
It's trademarked.
you coming up, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not actually trademarked, though. But yeah, I came up with it. Cool, good question. Okay, so Lotus is not the company. This was to jog my memory in case I forgot which one I wanted to talk about. So this was it was actually external and internal and all these other components for this specific client, but we found something very interesting when we did the external piece. So like always, our research on this organization starts with very in-depth reconnaissance. And so we have a very specific methodology defined about everything that we do every single time to make sure that we hit as much reconnaissance data as possible. One of those includes looking at breach data. Anybody ever do that as part of a pen test? Look at all of the breaches. I mean, there's tons now. Ashley Madison, Yahoo. There's tons of these smaller ones too. So we stockpile them and we search for the target organization's name and especially their email address. So anyone familiar with the Adobe breach in 2013? You are? Okay, cool. I'm seeing a couple head nods. So ultimately, it was roughly 10 gigabytes. I think that was the uncompressed size. And roughly, originally they come out with numbers that were like way lower. It was like a couple million, then 33 million, then 150 million accounts as part of this breach. And there are some other really, really interesting components to this breach, and I highly recommend that all of you research that breach afterwards for a dozen reasons. But just go read about it, and you'll find some cool stuff. Anyone know what the particularly unique thing about the passwords in the Adobe breach? Anyone know what the deal was with those? Nope. Not that they were insulted. Any other guesses? They were encrypted. Yeah. So, huge snafu. Anyone know why that's such a bad thing to do? To encrypt passwords? There you go, exactly. That's why we use hashing, because it's not reversible. Sure, you can brute force it, but then it's dependent on the password. Encryption, if I have the encryption key, I just decrypt all of the passwords. So, on that note, it's interesting because there was a lot of research done on what the actual encryption algorithm could be, the key, the mode, all of that. And as far as I understand, no one actually ever figured out the encryption algorithm. But because from a few stupid choices they made as well, we can infer more information about the passwords. And even more important than the encrypted form of the password was there was another component as part of this leak. Anyone want to guess what that was?
Hint.
Who said it?
Hint.
Yes, the password hint. So I highly recommend you go download this and look at some of the hints. It is eye-opening. So basically, we found roughly 150 users that were at this organization that were a part of this breach. And so we looked at all of their password hints. And because all of these are encrypted and not salted, so again, two different technologies, but if it were a hash and salted, this would not apply. But because it were encrypted, all of the users that had the same encrypted password had the same, that use the same password had the same encrypted text. So all we have to do is say, okay, this user has this encrypted password, show me everyone with that encrypted password, and let's look at all of those hints together. And you would be really surprised at the number that we can just basically reverse engineer / guess based on the password hints. So a lot of the things were like, password is password, or it would be, dog's name +1, and then it would be buddy plus number. It's like, okay, so maybe it's the dog's name is Buddy, the number is 1, we try that. So the interesting thing is that out of that 140, we found 7 users. And this was, mind you, the end of 2015, beginning of 2016, that had not changed their passwords in 3 years to this Lotus email system. So now we had access to 7 users' emails and passwords to log in and start getting sensitive data that way. But because it's a Lotus system, we also checked for this. Anyone know what the deal is with this? See somebody laughing? Yes, it's a directory of all the accounts in that Lotus email system. Do you know if there are any other vulnerabilities that were ever in this?
Doesn't that also contain a password hash in that?
Yes, it does. So now we have the entire directory and all of the hashed passwords for everyone in this organization based on breach data from 2013. So this was a big, big headache. At the time, I think it might have been brought into Hashcat at this point, but at the time, that specific hashing algorithm was only available in John the Ripper. And so it took a lot of mucking around because it was also like it was a specific patch that was only by default utilizing a specific version of JTR. So I will probably post this somewhere at some point just to save somebody some headaches. But we were able to basically brute force a ton of their passwords, all again stemming from that breach data. So why was this unique? We've utilized other breaches before. This was the one that I think was very kind of like, head on your forehead kind of thing, because it was like you had 3 years to just force your users to change their password once, and this might not be an issue at all. So we thought that was pretty unique how bad that was. So any other questions related to that one? Cool. All right, so this is external pen test at a software company where they said that they had they said that they get annual penetration tests done as required by Google because they develop software for Google. And when I asked him what types of results they got from previous pen tests, and I hear BS answers like, oh, you know, the typical, like, you know, cert issues and SSL issues, and I'm like, oh, like, we're going to wreck this company. If that, because clearly what that was a company scanning them with a vulnerability scanner, printing it out, and saying, there you go, we weren't able to do anything. And so this is one of those things that really helped highlight the difference in my mind and in the client's mind, the difference between a vulnerability assessment and a penetration test.
Really expensive list for self-science certs.
Yeah. So, as usual, starts with reconnaissance. Enumerated as much of the technical infrastructure as well as the human infrastructure for this organization. As part of that, we identified some web applications that they hosted that were exposed to the internet. We could register for accounts, generic user accounts on those applications and gain access to them without any type of manual authorization. So we did that. We're poking around. We identified only one system that had a SQL injection vulnerability. We were able to dump the entire database, including the user table. So we saw a bunch of users at this target organization that had credentials in the system. So okay, let's go about trying to crack those. We have a pretty awesome password cracking rig. It's 6 GPUs, I think, Radeon 9600 or something like that. So it's ridiculous speed. We were able to crack all potential. There was MD5, they were unsalted, and we were able to exhaust the 8-character upper or lower special key space within, I think, like 2 or 3 days. And we were at that point, we cracked about half of the people at the target organization, and a couple of them were mentioned online as administrators and marked in here as like an admin role. So we took that and we said, okay, let's see if they reuse these passwords anywhere. And so they had Google hosted email. So we log in their email, we're poking around, looking for keywords like VPN, remote, password. We found a bunch of interesting stuff, but not as much as we usually do. Some of the most interesting stuff we found, which isn't typical, is that we found a lot of SSH-related key data. So it wasn't necessarily private keys, but it was information about authenticating to SSH on some of the servers they hosted, but they were not accessible to us. So we said, okay, let's take these credentials and log into other of their web-related assets and see if that gets us anywhere. And so we logged into one system, which we had also created a user account on, but now that we logged in with an admin, it gave us new functionality. And so again, without giving too much information away, you're able to run jobs against data. And there was it was built into the web interface, but not necessarily displayed by default, which allowed them to essentially debug that job, which was run in Python or another language, which is very uncommon, so I'm not going to say it. So anyone see any issues with that? No one? You aware? Python from web interface? Anyone ever exploit that? All right, so you have a head nod. All right, cool, well then great. It's super easy. And so basically we said, okay, it looks like this admin account can execute arbitrary Python code. Let's see if that's the case. So the first thing we did was just tell it to run ping against a server that we host, and we watched for the DNS lookup. And so sure enough, we see the DNS lookup. It's like, we should have arbitrary Python code execution. And so Metasploit actually has a module for delivering a interpreter payload via Python. So we just use that, spun it up on our external VPS server, threw the payload at this guy, and sure enough, we got interpreter. So we were on what appeared to be an internal server, not necessarily on what looked like a DMZ, because we could see a lot of stuff. So one of the first things that we did was just run TCP dump for everything that was not destined for that host. So we get a little bit of good recon information about that internal network. And so one of the things that we specifically look for to help identify the domain-related information was DHCP. Anyone know like what we might be able to see in DHCP? There's 2 key things. So we get name servers, and we get the NetBIOS version of the domain. So if it's like companyx.com, then their NetBIOS name might be like CPX. It's a shortened version. So we needed that information to identify where their domain controllers might be, so we can target those specifically. So this was a particularly interesting one. So we used that tool I wrote, LDAP Dan. We enumerate via Active Directory all of the user accounts, and you need a valid set of credentials to query LDAP, but any credentials within the domain will work. So we tried all the credentials that we had from the SQL dump from the web application, and sure enough, not only did the ones we used to compromise that web application via Python, they worked, but we actually had a domain admin's password that was the same as that web application SQL dump for Active Directory. So we were able to immediately authenticate as a domain admin. So at that point, it was basically game over. We pilfered a bunch of interesting data, their source code, large government contracts, and data marked as confidential, and yada yada. The interesting thing was that the client had no idea that that component of the web application which ran the Python code was even attached to their internal network. He's like, oh yeah, that shouldn't be the case. I'm like, well, yeah, shit, no, it's not supposed to be the case. So that was an eye-opener. But for me, this is one of those stories that helps really solidify the difference between a vulnerability assessment and a penetration test. And again, I don't care at the end of the day what you call it. Depending on the specific scope and methods that we'll use, it's everything from a pen test to a red team engagement, but offensive services. So if you look at what would happen in a typical vulnerability assessment, they would have gotten to the point where they said, hey, we identified a SQL injection vulnerability, you need to fix that. And that would have been it. That'd be the end of the story. They say, okay, well, what's the real risk to our organization? And they might even base it solely on what's in that application and say, oh, you know what? This has public test data. It's meaningless. If a hacker were able to gain access to everything in that SQL database, we really don't care. And they might not, maybe they'll patch it, maybe they don't, but it doesn't necessarily change these other practices that we can't identify unless we continue to do the same exact things that a real-world attacker would do, like crack the passwords and see where else those passwords are being utilized. So again, we never would have identified that they have very poor password practices if we didn't take that information and continue on with it. And that to me is the number one difference beyond the quintessential answer of, in a pen test you exploit vulnerabilities and in a vulnerability assessment you don't. This really drives home that point that it's far beyond that. It's far beyond just exploiting vulnerabilities in code.
For like a big red team though, you might have somebody who just, or maybe like two guys in the red team who just do like network mapping and vulnerability scanning though, and then you would probably go and take that data from your red team members and go run exploits and vulnerabilities though, right, too.
Yeah, depending on the engagement. I'm not saying that you wouldn't use a vulnerability scanner or anything like that. Right. What I'm saying is that in a vulnerability assessment,
it stops after the scanner.
Exactly. Yeah, their ultimate goal is to just identify as many vulnerabilities as possible, but you don't understand the real risk and what an attacker would really do if those vulnerabilities remain open. And so again, this highlights that organization might continue to develop software with SQL injection vulnerabilities, but now they understand that it can be greatly exacerbated if they don't have unique passwords for each of their systems. So again, we're driving home things that we might not otherwise be able to identify. And so again, you take it a step further and you say during a vulnerability assessment, maybe you did even uncover that and you said, oh, you know what? Make sure you instruct all of your people to not reuse passwords. And so fair enough, maybe that does even have some impact at that organization, but we demonstrate the real impact and we do change attitudes because we have conversations with all those admins afterwards and we say, this is why it's so bad. This one little vulnerability in your web application leads me to everything you care about. And so that behavior needs to change. And so sure enough, not only did that change, but some other serious things. Yep.
So onto that, so we're kind of developing into the scheme where we don't use different passwords for different systems, we use SSO now. So where would you say the behavior change should occur with companies that use SSO rather than different?
Man, you want to just go right down that rabbit hole, don't you?
Yeah, I do.
So let's come back to that because there's so much of that, but I would say the short answer is it comes down to two things. One, compensating controls in defense and depth, So if you can do multi-factor authentication, then clearly you should be doing that. But two, and more importantly, is using SSO in related applications seems fine. The problem here was it was an external web application with junk data. So why ever have the same authentication capabilities as something that you really care about, like your internal servers that control the domain and have access to all your data? That's the big thing. So, but if you want, we can come back to it because it's a whole, we had that conversation for like 5 hours.
I'll tell you about why I asked the question
Cool.
after.
Yeah, great, cool. Yeah. All right, so the next slide is our daily double. First person to tell me what this is from gets a free ticket.
Arrested development.
What was that?
Arrested development.
Yes. All right. It has nothing to do with anything, but I figured, for a free ticket. Do you think you can make it in June? If not, you can always like sell it or give it away. But
I think I can give it away.
cool, awesome. All right, please do then. All right. So, any other questions about that software company external? Cool. Okay. So the final one we did, and I think you guys might like this. There's some cool similarities to what you guys were talking about. Is that we were contracted, and again, this is ongoing. Monday morning, when I get back to the office, we're going to take what we hope to be the final step in exploitation of this guy. But so the first step for us was to go, I've never done a thick client before. I've done plenty of web applications, we do a ton. And I've played with stuff related to client-side software, but I've never specifically been contracted to target a very specialized thick client. And so, this was a great learning experience for us. And so honestly, one of the things I love most about pen testing is that literally a test does not go by where I don't learn something new. You know what I mean? No matter how, I've been doing this for, professionally, I think almost 18 years, more as a hobby. And I still, every single time, learn something new. That's what I love about this field. So anyway, this was a whole new world. It was like, okay, cool, we're going to get to do a Windows-based thick client application. Did some research on it initially to see what other folks had done, and there isn't a lot out there. It seemed like there was maybe 1 or 2 decent papers, but it was all the obvious stuff about debugging, decompiling, reverse engineering, and all that stuff. And it didn't get into what I hope to be, a little more specific things to testing thick client applications. So we started with the obvious stuff, mapping the application. Discovered a tool that was new to me, API Monitor, which was an awesome tool. It allows you to look at all the different API calls made from that application, and you can narrow it down based on specific categories like crypto, encryption, hashing, compression, other areas. And so clearly we started with things like authentication and crypto. But anyway, I digress. And so we mapped it. It's a very, very basic application. It actually does a very, very small number of things very quickly and very well. And it's all related to gigantic stockpiles of data. And so the interesting thing is that it's a read-only application, though. So it only asks the server for information, displays it to the user, and that's it. And so that attack surface seemed relatively limited to us. So one of the first things we wanted to do was look at this network protocol and see if it used some sort of standard. So the first thing we learned after grabbing the network traffic was that it exchanges RSA keys. So it exchanges public keys from the server and from the client. And then after that, everything was in clear text. So it literally only cared about utilizing that to authenticate the user. And so we identified early on that it was an MD5 hash with a assault. Unfortunately, one of the interesting things was that the application handled that internally and did not use an external DLL. So that made it kind of obnoxious to find quickly, but we were able to identify early on, based on the data it sent to the crypt-encrypt function, which was part of the Windows API, what looked like a hash. And the way we did that was we authenticated as a user and grabbed that via API Monitor and said, okay, this is the whole call to crypt-encrypt. This is what gets encrypted and sent over the network. And then we tried a password that only had a 1-character difference, and we noticed the blob that changed matched the length requirement of an MD5 hash. So that's how we quickly identified, okay, this is probably doing MD5, and it's probably doing it internally to the application and not via DLL, because it's not making any calls to an API that we're watching. So anyway, that was interesting. We clearly alerted the client right away. We have an ongoing, we alert them to issues as we find them. To just get feedback and say, does this jive with what you guys believe to be the case? And so we're not wasting our time spinning our wheels. So it gets worse. They said, oh yeah, we're aware of that because we have encryption turned off right now on the network side. Because we typically force users to go over a VPN, we basically rely on that. We have the capabilities within the application to encrypt network traffic. Let us turn that on, you guys can focus on that. So they turned it on, and facepalm. Across different user sessions, it uses the same session key. Anyone see any issues with that? Can anyone explain what the issue is? Yes. Short answer, encryption is completely moot. So if I can decrypt any traffic from any other user, because we all share the same session key, what are you talking about? That's not encryption. So we identified that early on. And then also identified as part of that process that they use the same IV. Anyone know what the IV stands for and does? All right, you all know that one. Yeah, initialization vector. And so not only did they use the same IV across all sessions, guess what it was?
Zero?
All zeros. So if I have time, I'll tell you the most hilarious story after this. What time we got? But yeah, so those two design decisions were something that we never ever would have expected. It's like, this is the most basic thing, like, give your users unique session keys. Yeah, anyway, I digress. Rebreaker. There we go. Okay, so then, we know that there's issues with the encryption, and they're still working on figuring out that issue and patching it. But we wanted to understand the actual content of the packet. So we know we can read it in clear text, but we got to understand it because it ultimately looks a lot like binary data with some ASCII text in there, and it's hard to really understand what's happening between the client and server. So the first thing I did years and years ago, I wrote a bunch of programs using libpcap in C to sniff traffic. So dusted off the cobwebs on that stuff, wrote a quick, easy thing to basically read in a PCAP, print out the relevant components of that of the TCP data, and that allowed us to create a C structure to say, you know what, these 4 bytes look like they're related to this, and we'll print it out this way. These bytes look like this. And it was actually a really quick process for us to identify the inner workings of this protocol. And so, frankly, one of the people I was working with on this, he's super smart. He picked up on some stuff really quick. And we noticed a header that was consistent across all communication between the client and the server. So it was really obvious which packets we care about. So there was always like this magic header, and then after that, like the first 8 or 10 bytes, it got into chunks that would cycle through all these different values. But by creating that program and printing out the areas we cared about, we were able to very, very quickly see the patterns in those. And so the patterns that we saw were things like, okay, the client requests a data by filling in these fields, and it has these other fields set to zeros, and then when the server responds, it fills in those fields with its values, but the client's values match. And so we're able to quickly identify things like, and I think what we said, control commands. So where the client was making the decision, I want this thing, this blob of data, and this is the control number for it. And so most of that was in 2 bytes. And so it would be simple things like, number 7, number 8, and it would go through a series while it authenticated, cycling through these different, what we thought were commands. We also quickly identified that in addition to the TCP sequence and acknowledgement numbers, it had its own internal component for that. So the client will go through, and for each unique request it makes, it just basically increments this 2-byte word by 1. And so we're getting a good idea of what this what this communication pattern looks like. I request this data. My client-side sequence number is 20. I request the data from the server. It tells me its sequence number, which is 423. And then, okay, when I get that back, I respond again and say, okay, now my sequence number is 21. And so we can see this really easy exchange happening. And so we had a quick conversation with the client. We said, hey, this is what we're seeing. We want to make sure this jives with your expectations of the protocol. And basically what we got is, it kind of sounds right, but it's all proprietary. We're not going to acknowledge or disconfirm what you are telling us. So it kind of sucks, but anyway, as you can see, it didn't really make a difference. So next we wanted to move on to replaying packets. So we think we understand the general structure for making requests from the client to the server. Now we want to see if we can forge those requests for a couple different reasons. Not the least of which is if I can take a high-privileged user, sniff that traffic, again, all of the session keys are the same, so I can decrypt it, and replay that to the server as a less privileged user, will I get back that sensitive privileged data? And so we did a lot of research to identify an existing tool that would work to do this. And we found the only one that looked like it was, there were kind of two. And we threw EtherCap out because that was a mess the last time I tried to use it years and years ago. It just never was great about manipulating packets in real time. And so there was one burp nope extension, no HTTP proxy extension, something like that, which looked really promising. We've got burp pro licenses, so we threw it in. But no go was like kind of a headache. We spent like a day trying to get to work, and it's just not doing what we needed to do. And there was a professional something that was built like kind of to look like Wireshark, but it was they had a free trial version which didn't really seem to work, and it was just a hassle to use. So we said, screw it, let's just try to write our own thing. And so the first thing we did was we utilized the program I wrote in C to just implement the write functionality so that we could read in packets that we captured from a PCAP and just replay them. And so this was an awesome learning experience. I used to teach CCNA years and years ago, and we get deep into TCP connections and all that. And so it was crazy to revisit all that information and put it to practical use. And so there are things that were completely new to me, and that I had to relearn to implement something like this. So the first was dealing with the sequence numbers and the acknowledgement numbers to get them to jive, because if we captured those requests from the valid client, those specific TCP sequence numbers and acknowledgement numbers would no longer work. So we had to set up a live TCP connection and edit those to match what they should be. So using the Linux, I think we used the hex editor command, which I think was pretty good than hex edit, if I'm remembering correctly. Again, hopefully there will be a white paper after this. But we utilized that to just mark a couple specific bytes, change those manually, piped it into our program, replayed the packet, and eureka! We can replay any packet that we capture to the server, and it will respond with that legitimate data back to us. So that was pretty awesome. So again, it's similar to what you guys were doing with the alarm from a network perspective. Is that we can just wait, sniff this stuff, and replay it across any TCP session, and we're good. So the problem is that was way too onerous. We can't go through and manually hex edit all these packets to get the type of attack scenario that we want. Basically what we're trying to do now is change the privilege response from the server, instructing the client, hey, you have access to this type of functionality within the interface because some of the menu options are grayed out for the lower privileged users. So we want to see, is there an easy way to spoof that response from the server and vice versa to make both parties think that we have more privileges than we do. And so we can't do that manually. And so we did a ton of research, and the best option looked like Scapy. And I never learned Python before this engagement. Always makes me feel like an old fogey, but I use C, Perl, that generally accomplishes everything I wanted to. And I was really reluctant to learn Python until I learned Python, and it is freaking awesome. The thing that like was the big eye opener was when I needed to search an array for a specific value, which in Python is a single line of code, and in C it would have been like probably like 10 or 15, depending on what I need to do, or more. And I was like, literally, I'm like looking around the keyboard, like, oh, I feel so dirty. Like this is phenomenal. So if you don't know Python, learn Python. It's freaking phenomenal. So this specific module, NFQ, which was also new to me, is a way to instruct IP tables to pause specific packets and only forward them or drop them based on your manipulation of that queue. So again, I don't have a perfect understanding of NFQ. That's kind of like dumbed down version of it. It's new to me. We're still working on it. But we did, now that we had that capability, we can edit packets in real time using Python and Scapy. So I will at least post, a very generic version of these programs and scripts, so that hopefully other people can find good use for them. But we were able to use all of the basic functions within Scapy to flip the bits around that we need to attempt to do specific things. And the best part about that is that by doing it that way on live packets, we don't need to muck with sequence and acknowledgement numbers because we're just changing valid packets. So again, we're sniffing a packet from the client that says, hey, I'm Tyler, I'm trying to log in. Server's going to respond and say, okay, Tyler, you're good to go, but you're a low privilege user. We're trying to change that and say you're a high privilege user and see what happens. So anyway, we tried that. We're in the beginning stages of that, but we've seen success mucking with the data, requesting legitimate data. We get it back to support Gesundheit. So we think that we are right on the cusp of being able to basically access any data within this application with any user. So that was unique for a bajillion reasons, most of which I just covered. But again, hopefully I'll have a white paper out soon. Yeah, so other than that, that's all I got. If you guys have any specific questions. Yep.
Do you ever get to use your grappling hook?
No, still have not used my grappling hook. Yep. It's close one time to that, but decided not to break my ankles. So, yeah, good question. Did you have a question?
I was just going to add a book to your reading list, The Demon Sermon on the Martial Arts.
The Demon Sermon?
On the martial arts, yes.
Cool. All right. File that one away. Gracias. All right, cool. Anyone else? Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.